Chapter 4. On Main Street, we passed a bunch of truly boring stores, an insurance agency, an office supply store, and Mrs. DeSalvio's real estate office, its windows plastered with photos of houses. It was the only business that didn't have a Save the Magic sign in its window. Across the street was a drugstore, Golden Joe's Pizza Go-Go, and 3 or 4 consignment shops, selling everything from old clothes to even older appliances. The whole street had a tired look. Everybody goes to Walmart now, Arthur explained. Grandma says it's a real pity. She used to work at a nice little card shop, but it closed last year. People can buy stuff cheaper at Walmart. I'd heard my parents complain about the same thing. Dad was still mad about some big hardware chain that drove his favorite store out of business. But I guess that's how it was. People went where they could get the best prices. You couldn't really blame them. At last, Arthur stopped in front of the library. A tiny little storefront branch, not even a third the size of the one back home. Its windows were plastered with Save the Magic signs. I thought you might want to get a library card, he said, dumping his classic Raleigh on the sidewalk. I locked my trek to a bike rack, took off my helmet, and followed him inside, glad to escape the heat. The librarian sitting at the information desk smiled at Arthur. Well, well, she said, here's my favorite customer. Who's this with you? Logan Forbes, Arthur said. He just moved into Mrs. Donaldson's house, right next door to me. Oh, yes, I heard the new art teacher bought the place. She turned her smile on me. I'm Mrs. Bailey, Logan. Are you a bookworm like your buddy Arthur? I shrugged. Here was another person linking me with Arthur. It seemed there was no escaping it. I was doomed to be Arthur's friend. Reading's okay, I said as I took the pen she offered me and filled out an application for a library card. Like Arthur, I'd been the prize winner in my school's readathon, but I didn't want people thinking we were just alike. If I hadn't been scared of being caught in a lie, I'd have said I was too busy playing sports to read. That would have set us apart. Arthur was obviously no better at physical stuff than I was. We'll get your card into the mail tomorrow or the day after, she promised. In the meantime, Arthur can let you check out some books on his card. Sure, Arthur said, as long as you bring them back on time. I've never had an overdue in my life. Mrs. Bailey laughed. Arthur is absolutely exemplary in that regard. Come on, Arthur said to me. I'll give you a tour. We went to the children's room first, a small area in the back. I could tell at a glance I'd read most of the books. You can order stuff from other libraries, Arthur said, as if he'd guessed what I was thinking. That's how I read so many last year. I'm not sure there are even 500 books in this whole library. We browsed around a while. In the teen section, I found a science fiction paperback that looked good. Arthur picked up The Shining and started flipping through it. Hey, I've got an idea, he said. Let's get the newspaper from the day Mrs. Donaldson was killed, so you can read all about it. Without waiting for a response, Arthur headed back to Mrs. Bailey's desk. Do you remember when Mrs. Donaldson was murdered? Mrs. Bailey thought a minute or two. 3 years ago, July 17th. I remember because I was baking my daughter's birthday cake. I just counted out 6 candles when I heard the announcement on the radio. Could we see the newspaper from that day? Arthur asked. Logan wants to know everything about it, since it happened in his house and all. I'll be right back. Mrs. Bailey opened a door marked staff only and went inside. I don't want to read about it, I muttered. Yes, you do, Arthur said. I shrugged. Actually, he was right. I couldn't help being curious, but I didn't want to admit it. Wasn't it kind of morbid? Here it is. Mrs. Bailey had reappeared, holding a big book. These are the 2006 Bealsville Posts, all bound together in chronological order. Arthur led the way to a reading table and put the book down, turning the pages quickly to find what he'd wanted. Each time a page turned, motes of dust flew up and tickled my nose. Voila! Arthur pointed a grubby finger at a front page headline dated July 17th. Myrtle E. Donaldson murdered in her home. Bealsville. Things like this don't happen in Bealsville, Evan McCowan said when he learned of Mrs. Donaldson's murder. Unfortunately, Mr. McCowan is wrong. Like our big city cousins, our small town has its own murder to deal with, and everyone is reeling in shock, including the police, who have no leads as to the killer's identity. Neighbor discovers body. Yesterday, Darla Jenkins, age 68, of 4301 Navajo Street, found her neighbor dead at the bottom of the cellar steps. Myrtle E. Donaldson, age 61, died from head injuries resulting from the fall. The house was in disarray, leading police to theorize that Mrs. Donaldson was the victim of a robbery. She was apparently pushed down the steps by an intruder who also tried but failed to kill her dog. So far, the police have no suspects. Will be remembered by many. Mrs. Donaldson will be remembered by many as the genial ticket taker at the beloved Magic Forest amusement park on Route 23 West. She was employed there from 1960 until her untimely death. The only blot on her career was the recent discovery that a large sum of money had been embezzled from the park. Mrs. Donaldson was questioned more than once, leading some to believe that she was a chief suspect, but no evidence was found linking her to the crime. The theft forced the park owner Edward Farrell into bankruptcy. Consequently, he has no plans to reopen next summer. In fact, he has already received an offer from someone interested in developing the land. Thus ends a tradition of cooling off with Old King Cole, Willie the Blue Whale, Cinderella, and all the other beloved larger-than-life nursery rhyme characters. Police Chief at a loss. In his statement to the press regarding Mrs. Donaldson's death, Police Chief Robert Manning refuted allegations of a connection between the murder and the amusement park's missing funds. He has requested that anyone with information about the murder step forward. At this time, Chief Manning believes Mrs. Donaldson was the victim of a random killing committed by a stranger passing through Bealsville in search of money or valuables. We hope this proves to be correct and not the beginning of a crime wave in our peaceful town. Funeral. Services for Myrtle E. Donaldson will be held at Bradley's Funeral Home on July 22nd at 10 a.m. Burial will follow at Stillwater's Memorial Gardens. Mrs. Donaldson, a lifelong resident of Bealsville, was predeceased by her parents, Daniel and Sophie Atkins, and her husband, Peter Donaldson. She leaves her daughter, Violet Phelps, her son-in-law, Silas Phelps, 2 grandchildren, several nieces and nephews, and numerous friends and relatives. I studied Mrs. Donaldson's smiling photograph. She wasn't the sort of person you'd expect to end up getting murdered in her own home, or to be suspected of embezzling. Do you think she stole the money? I asked. No way. Arthur touched Mrs. Donaldson's photograph with his stubby finger. But you know how it is. People started rumors, and pretty soon most of the town believed she'd hidden it somewhere in her house, which could be why Silas Phelps killed her. Silas Phelps? I stared at Arthur. The newspaper said the police had no suspects. Arthur shrugged. Grandma is positive he did it. But he was her son-in-law. If you'd lived in Bealsville as long as I have, Arthur said, you'd understand. The Phelpses and the Jarmans are the worst families in town. They're all related to each other. The most twisted DNA you'll ever come across. Grandma says they're directly descended from Cain. Arthur leaned closer. Silas is the worst of all the Phelps. You could call him a one-man crime wave. Car theft, armed robbery, drugs, assault. He's been in jail most of his adult life. Noticing I'd gotten kind of tense, Arthur patted my shoulder. You don't have to worry about Silas. He's back in jail for holding up a gas station out on Route 703. Used a gun. He's one bad dude. While I sat there picturing Silas as a modern-day Bill Sikes, straight out of Oliver Twist, Arthur turned to the next day's paper. For about a week, the murder was covered, slowly working its way from front-page headlines to back-page paragraphs, tucked away between bicycle thefts and other small-town stuff. But it was always the same. Except for the occasional mention of the embezzled money, there was no clue to who killed Mrs. Donaldson or why. Well, that's it. Arthur got up and stretched, inflating his bony chest with a deep breath. You want to make some photocopies for your parents? They should know the facts. I reached into my pocket. 4 quarters, 2 nickels, and 3 pennies. More than enough to copy the first article, which was the most important one, and, as Arthur pointed out, the only one that mentioned his grandmother. Make me a copy too, Arthur said. I'll pay you back. I doubted that, but I made him a copy anyway. Arthur carried the heavy book back to Mrs. Bailey. She took it and handed it to the woman standing beside her. Here you are, she said. It's so odd to have 2 people wanting the same year of the Bailesville Post on the same day. The woman smiled at Arthur and me. Even though she was at least 30, she was still really good looking. Long dark hair, pretty eyes, nice mouth, small nose, kind of tall, slim but not skinny. She was built, really built. Arthur and I oogled her shamelessly. Why would boys your age be reading musty old newspapers? She asked in a friendly way. Arthur gestured at me and said, My friend Logan just moved into the house next door to me. An old lady got killed there 3 years ago. He wanted to see the newspaper story. He held up his photocopy, which was already creased and dirty. And the lady leaned down to take a look. Her long hair swung against Arthur's cheek, and he blushed. What an amazing coincidence, she said. That's the very story I'm looking for. How come? Arthur asked, obviously puzzled. I'm an investigative reporter from the Richmond Times, she said. We're running a series on unsolved crimes, what they call cold case files. My editor assigned the Donaldson killing to me. You should talk to my grandmother, Arthur said. She's the one who found the body. See? He stabbed at his photocopy with his finger. That's her, Mrs. Darla Jenkins. My name's Arthur. We live right next door to Mrs. Donaldson's old house, where Logan's living now. The woman opened her purse and pulled out a notebook. Please give me your grandmother's name and phone number. I'll call her. Darla Jenkins, Arthur spelled, even though the woman probably already knew how to spell both names. Our phone number is unlisted. Lowering his voice, he whispered the number. She wrote it down carefully. Thank you, Arthur. Turning to me, she added, if it's all right with your parents, I'd like to see your house and take some photographs. May I have your parents' names and phone number too? I gave them to her, and she thanked us again. My name is Nina Stevens. She handed us each a small white card with her name and phone number on it. Now, I must read these articles. It was nice meeting you. I'll see you soon. With that, she sat down and began poring over the newspaper. Outside, the sun hit my face like a blast from a furnace. I wished I hadn't spent my money on photocopies. An ice-cold soda sure would have tasted good. We might get in the newspaper, Logan, Arthur said happily. Maybe she'll even take our pictures. Won't that be something to talk about when school starts? I nodded. But I didn't see why Nina Stevens would want to waste her time photographing us. There was no sense in telling Arthur that, though. Let him daydream about being famous if it made him happy. Chapter 5. When I got home, the first thing I saw was Johnny O'Neill mowing the lawn. He was riding one of those little tractor things, and grass flew everywhere. It smelled like summer, sweet and fresh and damp. Mom was sitting on the front porch reading a crime novel. I dropped the photocopy in her lap. Want to read about a real murder? She jumped as if I'd dropped the body itself in her lap, but she read the article. When she finished, she looked up at me. I'd almost convinced myself Arthur made the whole thing up, but I guess it's true after all. She shivered and folded her arms tightly across her chest. That poor woman, such a horrible way to die. I sat down beside her. When Arthur and I were at the library, we met a reporter from the Richmond Times. Her paper's doing a series on unsolved crimes. You know, what they call cold case files. She's writing about Mrs. Donaldson's murder, and she wants to take some pictures of our house. I'd better tell your father. Photocopy in hand, Mom went inside with me right behind her. Dad was in the kitchen talking to a contractor about a new roof. Look at this, Mom waved the photocopy. Everything Arthur said is true. Mrs. Donaldson really was murdered right here in this very room. The contractor nodded affably. Didn't you folks know that? Mom shook her head. Isn't there some sort of law that makes it illegal to hide things like this about a house? She asked. Dad sighed. It's hardly worth pursuing. We've bought the place. We've moved in. I've hired a roofer, a plumber, an electrician. I can't see leaving because a woman was murdered here. I'll never enjoy cooking a meal in this kitchen, Mom said. Dad gave her a long look. Let's face it, Carolyn, you've never enjoyed cooking a meal anywhere. The contractor and I laughed, but Mom poured herself a cup of coffee and went outside to drink it on the porch. She'd never had much of a sense of humor about herself. That evening, Nina Stevens called and made a date to come to our house the very next day. So when Arthur showed up at breakfast in the morning, I stopped him in the doorway. Guess who's coming at 11 o'clock to take pictures of the crime scene? She'll be at my house at 10 sharp to talk to Grandma. Arthur slipped past me and helped himself to a glass of orange juice. She's taking pictures of Grandma and me too. He scooped up his usual handful of raisin bran and stuffed it in his mouth. What do you want to do till she gets here? Finish my breakfast, I said. Arthur laughed and took a second helping of raisin bran. At 9:30, we perched on Arthur's front steps and played chess while we waited for Miss Stevens. Much as I hated to admit it, Arthur was better at strategy than I was. By the time the sporty little red Miata pulled into the driveway, I was losing big time. Scattering chessmen everywhere, we jumped to our feet, waving like loyal subjects. If I'd had a cap, I would have doffed it. Good morning, Miss Stevens, Arthur said, giving her his biggest grin. Welcome to our humble abode. She smiled. Miss Stevens sounds so formal. Why don't you boys just call me Nina? Nina. Arthur drew in his breath as he just said a magic word. All right, Nina. Mrs. Jenkins must have been looking out the window, for she joined us on the porch before Nina had reached the first step. After she'd introduced herself, Nina complimented Mrs. Jenkins on the blossoms of a scraggly rosebush languishing by the porch. Mrs. Jenkins laughed. That poor old bush has seen better days, just like me. Arthur and I followed the women inside. If I hadn't been so eager to hear every word Nina said, I'd have probably been more amazed by Mrs. Jenkins' decorating taste. One wall tiled with mirrors, a huge recliner in front of the TV, a sagging sofa with faded slipcovers, a lava lamp on a small table, and at least a dozen badly done paintings of clowns on the walls, plus crowds of little ceramic clowns on the mantelpiece, on knick-knack shelves, on top of the TV, and surrounding the lava lamp. She collects them, Arthur whispered. Don't ask me why. In the kitchen, where more clowns leered at us from the walls and countertops, Nina sat down at the table and opened a little notebook. Before she asked about Mrs. Donaldson, she said, I just love your clowns, Mrs. Jenkins. They're adorable. You must have been collecting them for years. Mrs. Jenkins looked around the room. You know how it is, she said with a smile. You get a few here and a few there. Before you know it, people start giving them to you. Pretty soon you have more than you know what to do with. She picked up one and grinned at its round face. You can never have enough clowns. At last, Nina began asking Mrs. Jenkins about Mrs. Donaldson. She seemed especially interested in the magic forest. Do you think she embezzled the money? No, indeed. Mrs. Jenkins glared at Nina. Myrtle Donaldson was the most honest woman in the world. I never heard her tell a lie or cheat in any way. It hurt her deeply to be questioned about the missing money. Nina paused and jotted down a few words in her notebook. People who know the victims often think they know who killed them, she said. I was wondering if I'd put my money on Silas Phelps. Mrs. Jenkins sat up straighter. There was bad blood between him and Myrtle. She didn't want him to marry her daughter Violet, did her best to prevent it. But Violet ran off and married him anyway. She took a swallow of coffee. Silas treated that poor girl real bad. She was always coming home to her mother, dragging her kids with her. Then Silas would show up, demanding she come home, and he and Myrtle would get into it. I had to call the police more than once. I was scared he'd kill all of them. You read about things like that in the paper, but I guess in your profession you know that. When Mrs. Jenkins paused to wave a fly away from the sugar bowl, Nina said, But why would he kill her? What was his motive? Here's what I think. Mrs. Jenkins looked at all of us as if to make sure we were listening. Silas probably believed Myrtle had the missing money hidden in her house. He came to get it, and when she put up a fight, he killed her. As I said, he never liked her or the dog. Why do you think the police didn't suspect Silas? Oh, they talked to him, but he said he was home watching TV and Violet backed him up. She was so scared of him, she'd say whatever he told her to say, even with her hand on the Bible. She was more scared of Silas than the Lord, and that's the sad truth of it. Mrs. Jenkins pressed her lips together and shook her head sadly. I still miss Myrtle. You never get over a murder, especially when the killer's out there somewhere free to do what he likes, and Myrtle's dead in her grave. Silas is in jail now, Arthur pointed out. But not for murder, Mrs. Jenkins said. He'll be out in no time. Just wait and see. What became of Violet? Nina asked. Mrs. Jenkins poured herself another cup of coffee. She and the kids are living in a mobile home at the Phelps place. Can't afford to move. She thought for a moment. The last I heard, Violet was working at the Walmart on Route 23. She might still be there. Not many jobs in Bealsville. Thanks. I'll see if I can find her. Nina jotted something in her notebook. There's one more thing you could probably help me with. I rented a car, but it doesn't have a navigational device. With my terrible sense of direction, I'm thinking of hiring a local to show me the area. Me! Arthur jumped up as if he were volunteering for extra credit at school. I can show you everything in Bealsville and beyond. Ask Logan. I just gave him a great tour. Nina smiled. Thanks, Arthur, but I want someone who's at least 18. Try Johnny O'Neill at Golden Joe's Pizza Go-Go, Mrs. Jenkins suggested. He's always looking for extra cash. Nina wrote down Johnny's name and closed her notebook. Now, if I could take a few pictures, I'll be on my way. I've taken up far too much of your time already. It was what Arthur and I had been waiting for. Flanking Mrs. Jenkins, we grinned through at least 10 shots. After Nina took some of Mrs. Jenkins by herself, she went outside and aimed her camera at our house. She must have shot dozens of pictures from all possible angles. Nina noticed Bear sitting on our back porch. "Is that your dog, Logan?" "No," Arthur said, without giving me a chance to do more than open my mouth. "That's Bear, Mrs. Donaldson's dog. Grandma and I have been taking care of him since she was killed, but he spends most of his time on Logan's porch. I think he's waiting for Mrs. Donaldson to come home." "How sad." Nina followed Arthur and me into my yard and took a few pictures of Bear lying by our door. Mom and Dad stepped outside to welcome Nina. Inside, she devoted herself to photographing every room upstairs and down, including the dark cobwebby basement. She wanted a feeling, she said, of Mrs. Donaldson's life and death. "Does that lead to the attic?" she asked, pointing to a door in the upstairs hall. "Yep," Dad said. "I'm planning to have a fan installed to draw the hot air out of the house. It'll be a very efficient cooling system." "Is it possible for me to have a look?" "Of course." He opened the door to a steep flight of steps leading up into a dusty darkness. "Nothing to see," he said, "just dust and a ton of Mrs. Donaldson junk that nobody ever removed." Nina climbed the stairs and disappeared into the darkness. She stayed there so long I was tempted to ask if she was okay. When she finally came down, she had a smudge of dirt on her cheek and cobwebs in her hair. "Well," she said, "if you could tell me a little bit about why you moved to Bealsville and how you felt when you learned Mrs. Donaldson was murdered, I'll be finished here." "I got a job at the high school teaching art," Dad began. "And we were sick of the crime in Richmond," Mom put in. "So what happens? We buy a house in a small town and find out the previous owner was murdered." Nina looked sympathetic. "You must have been horrified." Mom nodded, but before she could elaborate, Nina got up to leave. "Thank you so much for your time." "When will the story be in the paper?" Arthur asked. "I'm not sure," she said. "It's part of a series. I suppose the editors will decide when all the articles are ready." Arthur and I followed Nina outside and watched her drive away in her nifty red car. "You know what we should do?" Arthur said. "Ride our bikes to the magic forest and take a look around. I haven't been out there for ages." "I thought you said it was closed." "It is." Arthur picked up a stone and chucked it at a pot drooping with dead flowers on his back porch. The stone thunked against the house, missing the pot by at least a foot. "But I know how to get in." "You ought to see it before it's bulldozed." "Logan," Mom called. "Lunch will be ready soon." Arthur was about to follow me, but his grandmother stopped him. "There's a nice bologna sandwich waiting for you on the table, Artie." "See you later," he called and ran inside. Chapter 6. Arthur showed up after lunch just in time to wolf down at least a half a bag of fancy chocolate chip cookies, the expensive kind Mom usually doles out 2 at a time. "I guess I'd have to say these are better than the grocery store brand Grandma buys," he admitted. As he reached for another helping, Mom snatched up the bag and put it in the cupboard, slamming the door a little more forcefully than necessary. "Let's go outside," I said, hoping to preserve the peace. Although Arthur didn't realize it, he was perilously close to being sent home in disgrace. Unaware that he'd done anything wrong, Arthur followed me onto the back porch. "How about riding our bikes to the magic forest?" he asked. "How far is it?" Arthur shrugged. "A couple of miles, I guess." We pedaled down Navajo Street to Route 23 West. As we neared the Toot and Tote convenience store on the edge of town, 5 boys about my age came outside carrying big cups of soda. The minute they spotted Arthur, they surrounded his bike and mine. "Hey, it's Art the Fart," a lanky redhead said. A mean-faced kid wearing a faded t-shirt grabbed Arthur's handlebars. "Cool bike," he said. "Where'd you find it? At the junkyard?" "Remove your filthy hands from my bicycle," Arthur said, in what could only be described as a snooty voice. "Who's going to make me?" Mean Face asked, looking even meaner if that was possible. Then the redhead noticed me. Hey, look, Arthur's got a friend. The boys lost interest in Arthur. What's your name? Mean-Faced asked me. Where do you live? His name's Logan, Arthur answered for me, which was just as well because my mouth had gone dry. He lives right next door to me. You live in my grandma's house? Mean-Face dropped his voice a few notches lower. His face was so close to mine, I could see the pores in his skin and the anger in his eyes. She was murdered there, he added in even a lower voice, almost a hiss. Did you know that? From the look on his face, you'd think I'd killed his grandmother. Arthur told me, I managed to say in a sort of squeaky voice. Arthur told him, Mean-Face turned to his friends and laughed. Arthur the idiot told him. Arthur the moron told him. They took it up like a chant. The words ran together, losing their meaning, making my head hurt. Arthur told him, Arthur told him, Arthur told him, Arthur the idiot, Arthur the moron. While they chanted, they tried to yank my bike away. One cuffed my helmet, another snatched my water bottle. Just as I toppled off my bike, somebody grabbed Mean-Face and gave him a shake. Hey, what do you think you're doing, Danny? It was Johnny O'Neill. The other boys backed away. Nothing, Mean-Face muttered. Just kidding around, the red-headed kid added. That's all. Imbeciles. Arthur spoke just loud enough for the boys to hear. Very smart, I thought. Definite proof he was a genius. You okay, Logan? Johnny asked. Yeah, sure. I got to my feet and straightened my helmet, picked up my bike, and stuck the water bottle in its holder. My left knee was scraped and bleeding, but I didn't mention it. The boys lingered in a tight little gang watching us, ready to run if they had to. Have you started working for Nina yet? Arthur asked. Johnny? Johnny glanced at Arthur. Who? Nina Stevens, Arthur said, the reporter from the Richmond, the one who's working on Mrs. Donaldson's murder. Oh, yeah, Nina the reporter, good-looking lady. He tossed a strand of dark hair out of his eyes and grinned. Couldn't do it. I'm working 2 jobs already, delivering pizza and helping Logan's dad. I gave her Billy Jarman's number. He's always looking for work. You gave that bum Nina's phone number? Arthur stared at him in disbelief. Johnny tapped Arthur's bony chest with one finger, just hard enough to hurt. Hey, kid, watch what you say about Billy. He's my cousin, you know. Arthur backed away and straddled his bike. Come on, Logan, he muttered. Johnny gave my shoulder a playful punch, and he headed into the convenience store. Tell your dad I'll be by this afternoon to finish the lawn, he called from the door. Mean-Faced Danny and his gang had regrouped under a tree at the edge of the Toot and Tote parking lot. The redhead gave me the finger, but I pretended not to see. Arthur was already several yards ahead, pumping hard, and I pedaled after him. Since the boys didn't have bikes, they couldn't follow us. A big relief. Danny Phelps is my #1 enemy, Arthur said. He hates me because I'm smarter than him and all of his family put together. He's the dumbest kid in Billsville. If a teacher could stand him for more than 1 year, he'd be lucky to be in 2nd grade. Why did he say I live in his grandmother's house? Because you do. Violet's his mother and Silas is his old man. Arthur turned his head to grin at me and almost rode off the road. Swerving away from a ditch, he added, Danny was nicer before his grandma was murdered. In fact, he was almost human. Believe it or not, we used to play together. When he was staying at your house, you know, those times when Violet had to get away from Silas, Arthur frowned. Of course we were little then. By grade school, I had figured out he was dope. Out of town, Route 23 turned into a narrow highway with more curves and hills than a roller coaster. Trucks and cars whizzed past as I struggled uphill and wobbled down, braking to keep from going too fast. I couldn't understand how Arthur managed to get ahead of me on a 3-speed bike. Worse yet, the road's shoulder was narrow, overgrown with weeds, and littered with stuff thrown from car windows. Beer and soda cans, bottles, plastic bags, fast food wrappings. We had to ride on the edge of the asphalt most of the time. Houses got farther apart, and soon we were in farm country. Rolling hills stretched away toward the mountains. Cows lie in the shade, chewing their cuds, looking thoughtful. Now and then a dog barked. The air smelled of honeysuckle and cut grass and diesel fumes. If it hadn't been for the hills and the traffic and the heat, it would have been a great ride. After an hour or more, we reached the top of a hill. Below us, I saw a fake stone castle wall with towers. Near the road, a life-size statue of old King Cole perched on top of a tall sign that said, "Welcome to the Magic Forest." The statue's paint was faded. His body was cracked. He was missing an arm. The other arm pointed at a sagging red gate. Over it, a tilting green dragon, minus a tail, stood guard, grinning a goofy grin. On the gate, a sign riddled with bullet holes said, "Closed for the season." Arthur sped down the hill, holding both skinny arms above his head, something I didn't dare do, and yelling, "Wahoo!" "Are you crazy?" I hollered, but he was already at the bottom, screeching to a stop in the weedy parking lot. The gate to the park was padlocked, but Arthur led me to a narrow path running along a sagging chain-link fence, posted with no trespassing signs and red notices warning that the property was condemned as unsafe. Hiding our bikes in the bushes, we followed the fence into the woods, trying to see what was on the other side. It was no use. A wild green vine draped everything. The fence, trees, telephone poles. "It's a jungle," I said. "Kudzu," Arthur said. "It grows all over everything." Warming to the subject, he elaborated. "Kudzu, the killer plant, engulfs entire buildings, towns, trains, cars. It's unstoppable, indestructible, determined to conquer the world. Soon, stop." I gave Arthur a shove, and he staggered backward, giggling. "It's true," he said. "Once it gets started, Kudzu takes over." Grandma knew this man who never left his house, too lazy to do anything but lie around all day. Well, one day he decided he just had to go to the store. But when he opened his door, all he saw was Kudzu. He didn't have a hatchet or a chainsaw, so he was trapped. Pretty soon the kudzu oozed in under the door and through the windows. Now you'd never know a house was there. "What happened to the man?" Arthur shrugged. "I guess he's still in there." "That's not true," I said, annoyed at myself for almost believing him. "Ask Grandma. You didn't believe me about the murder either." I followed him deeper into the jungle. At last we came to a gap in the fence just big enough for us to squeeze through. Another bullet-ridden no trespassing sign hung over our heads. Arthur wiggled through the hole anyway. "How about the sign?" I pointed at the red words printed on a rusty white background. He shrugged. "I've ridden my bike out here lots of times, and I've never seen a watchman or a guard dog or anything, except maybe some teenagers fooling around. It's a great place to pretend you're searching for the ruins of ancient civilizations like Indiana Jones in the movies." I hesitated, but Arthur was already vanishing into the kudzu. Taking a deep breath, I followed him into the magic forest. It was the first time I'd ever trespassed, and I couldn't help thinking I'd just taken a step into a new and dangerous life.